All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today, we're tackling a topic where two pretty complex worlds collide: mental health and the criminal justice system.
Definitely a fascinating intersection.
Oh, yeah, specifically in England and Wales, right?
Right.
Our source material for this one, well, it seems like it's pulled straight from study notes for psychiatrists,
Yeah.
gearing up for some big exam all about forensic psychiatry.
Sounds intense.
So, get ready to learn how the law tries to handle the tricky issue of mental health in criminal cases. We're talking
Yeah.
everything from legal defenses to the impact of stalking.
Just a real deep dive into the legal system and all those psychological factors that can, really make or break a case.
Yeah, it's more intertwined than people think, probably.
More than you'd think, yeah.
Okay, so let's say someone with mental health issues, enters the criminal justice system. What happens then? These notes mention all these different sections, like legal sections.
Right.
Makes the whole thing sound pretty complicated.
It can be, yeah. You got everything from those informal admissions where, someone voluntarily seeks help
Yeah.
to Section 2 or 3, those are the civil detentions,
Hmm?
When there's a risk to the person themselves or others.
Right, right.
And if a court needs a mental health assessment before, making a decision about someone's case, that's where Section 35 comes in.
Okay, so depending on their situation, there are a lot of different routes.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Lots of different pathways.
But ultimately, the goal is to figure out what kind of help or intervention they need,
Great.
right?
Yeah. Ultimately, it's all about figuring out the best way to support them and make sure everyone is safe.
Support and safety. Got it. Okay, so something that's always kind of been a hot topic, it's captured the public imagination, I guess. Psychiatric defenses.
Yeah, fascinating stuff.
It's like when someone's mental state at the time of a crime becomes a key factor. It's a central part of the case,
Exactly. And to understand those defenses, I think we have to start with two fundamental legal concepts: actus reus and mens rea.
Okay, break those down for me.
So actus reus is the guilty act.
Yeah.
Basically, the crime itself.
Okay, got it.
And then you have mens rea, which is the guilty mind, the intent behind the act.
So it's not just about what they did, but what their mental state was at the time, like their intention.
Exactly. Exactly.
I can see how that gets super complicated when mental health is involved.
Absolutely. And that's where those psychiatric defenses come into play. For instance, fitness to plead, that comes up even before the trial even starts.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And it really boils down to whether someone is mentally capable of understanding the charges against them, the court proceedings, and, the possible consequences.
So what happens if they're not considered fit to plead?
Well, the court might order treatment, until they are deemed fit. Or even explore, alternative legal processes.
Oh, okay. So if they are deemed fit for trial, then defenses like not guilty by reason of insanity could come up, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's when those defenses become relevant.
That's the one you always hear about in movies and TV. I'm sure it's way more nuanced in real life, though.
Oh, it definitely is.
Oh.
It's not as simple as it seems in Hollywood. It all goes back to something called the McNaughton Rules, which were established way back in 1843.
Wow, 1843. Okay.
Yeah, it's been around for a while. And for this defense to succeed, you have to prove that at the time of the crime, the defendant had a defective reason stemming from a disease of the mind.
So a pretty high bar to clear then.
It is. Basically, they have to show that they either didn't understand what they were doing or didn't realize it was wrong.
So it's not just any mental health condition. It has to be one that seriously messed with their understanding of their actions and whether they were wrong.
Exactly. It has to significantly impact their ability to understand the nature and consequences of their actions.
Okay, so say someone successfully uses this defense. What happens then? Do they just walk free?
Not necessarily, no. English courts actually have quite a few options available to them. Everything from hospitalization to treatment orders and other measures.
Oh, okay. So it's more about recognizing the impact of their mental state, right?
Right.
Not just a get out of jail free card.
Exactly. It acknowledges the influence of mental state on culpability.
Okay. And what about diminished responsibility? I feel like I've heard that one a lot too, like in legal dramas and stuff.
Yeah, that one's interesting. It can actually reduce a murder charge to manslaughter. The idea is to show the defendant didn't have the mens rea, that guilty mind we talked about, required for murder.
So they might have done the act, but they weren't fully consciously intending to kill.
Right. And here's something interesting. It's more often granted to women and people without any prior criminal record.
Huh. That raises some questions, right?
It does. It makes you wonder about potential biases in the system.
For sure. Okay, and then there's automatism, which, I'll be honest, sounds kind of far out there.
It is pretty rare, but essentially the argument is that someone's actions were involuntary, like they weren't in control of what they were doing.
Like the sleepwalking defense, right?
Yeah, like sleepwalking. But of course, there's more to it than that.
I figured.
Things like epilepsy or even really low blood sugar from a medical condition, those could fall under this defense too.
So all sorts of things could trigger it.
Right. And it gets a little tricky because there's a difference between sane and insane automatism.
Sane and insane. Okay, that sounds pretty confusing.
It is a bit nuanced. Sane automatism suggests it was a one-time thing with an external cause, whereas insane is more likely to happen again, and it comes from an internal condition, like sleepwalking tied to a mental disorder.
So even sleepwalking as a defense isn't like a sure thing. What kind of proof would you even need for that?
Yeah, it's tough. You need strong evidence. Things like a family history of sleepwalking, the crime happening right after they fell asleep, or being like confused and disoriented during the act.
Oh, wow. So like
Yeah.
actual medical evidence, not just someone saying, oh, I was sleepwalking.
Exactly. You often need medical and psychological evaluations to back it up.
It really shows how important expert testimony is in these cases.
It's crucial, absolutely.
Wow, it's amazing, really. The legal system tries to account for so many different possibilities.
It's quite intricate.
We've covered fitness to plead, not guilty by reason of insanity, diminished responsibility, automatism. Before we move on, can you quickly explain culpable homicide?
Oh, yeah. Good one.
It sounds like it's in a category all by itself.
It kind of is. It sits somewhere between manslaughter and homicide. Basically, there wasn't a specific intent to kill, but the defendant's actions still caused someone's death.
Ah, okay. So like recklessness or negligence leading to a fatal outcome.
Exactly. And it can be further divided into involuntary and voluntary culpable homicide.
So in one case, it's truly unintentional, and in the other, it might be more like driven by strong emotions or just being reckless.
Exactly. It's fascinating how the law tries to categorize these situations.
Yeah, definitely. And before we get into stalking, let's touch on one more defense: intoxication.
Oh, yeah, the classic I was too drunk defense.
Does it ever actually work?
Well, rarely. It
Yeah.
only really applies in specific situations. Like if someone involuntarily consumed a substance, like their drink was spiked or they had an unexpected reaction to medication.
That makes sense. You're not responsible for something you didn't choose to do.
Right. But voluntary intoxication, like if you willingly got drunk or high, generally no. You're still responsible for your actions.
This seems fair.
Yeah, you can't just blame it on the substances.
Right. It's about taking responsibility for your choices. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already, from the initial pathways someone might take through the system to all those fascinating psychiatric defenses.
Yeah, it's been a whirlwind tour of the legal landscape so far.
A whirlwind. That's a good way to put it. But we're not done yet.
Not even close.
Yeah.
Next, we'll dive into the world of stalking.
Uh-oh.
It's a crime that often goes much deeper than people think.
And has a huge impact on victims.
Absolutely. We'll unravel all of that in the next part.
Stalking, huh? Okay, so most people probably picture like a shadowy figure,
Right.
lurking in the dark, like something out of a movie. But these notes, they paint a very different picture, don't they?
Yeah, it's a lot more complex than that. And it often unfolds in ways you just wouldn't expect.
So it's not always so obvious.
No, not at all. Stalking is really about this pattern of behavior, repeated and unwanted intrusions into someone's life. And it can take so many forms.
Like what kind of behaviors are we talking about here?
Well, we're talking unwanted contact, constant surveillance, communication through like calls, emails, letters,
Oh, wow.
even things like graffiti.
Really? Graffiti?
Yeah, it can get pretty intense. And it can escalate to threats, physical assaults, even ordering things in the victim's name or messing with their bank accounts or online accounts. It's all about exerting control, instilling fear.
That's really scary. It's chilling to think someone would go to those lengths,
It is. It's a serious violation of someone's privacy and safety.
And these notes, they mentioned some pretty disturbing statistics about how common this is.
Yeah, they do.
It said something like 15% of the women interviewed had been stalked at some point.
15%, that's right. And it really highlights that gendered aspect of this crime.
Yeah.
The majority of stalkers are men, and most victims are women, particularly women in their reproductive years.
It's kind of scary how common this actually is. So what drives someone to stalk another person? Like, is there a common thread that connects these cases?
Well, there are different types of stalkers, each with their own motivations. The notes actually lay out several categories.
Okay, so different categories of stalkers.
Right. You've got the rejected stalker, often an ex-partner looking for reconciliation or sometimes revenge. Then there's the intimacy seeker. That's someone who's fixated on someone they believe they're in love with.
Ah, okay.
And then you've got the incompetent suitor who just, lacks social skills.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the resentful stalker, driven purely by revenge. And then the most dangerous type, the predatory stalker, whose actions are part of a larger pattern of sexual offending.
So a whole spectrum of motivations then.
Yeah, definitely. But what's interesting is that the notes point to a link with personality disorders, especially in those first few categories.
So things like issues with attachment or emotional regulation, maybe a distorted sense of self. Those could all play a part.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes substance abuse is involved too, which just fuels those impulsive and destructive behaviors.
Right. It can make things even worse. But so it's not always about personality disorders then.
No, not always. Sometimes we see more severe mental illnesses like delusional disorders or psychosis actually driving the stalking behavior.
So someone might be acting on like distorted beliefs or even hallucinations.
Exactly. And that just adds another layer of complexity to these cases.
It does. So how do you even begin to manage someone who's stalking?
Well, it starts with understanding what's driving their behavior. Treatment is important, but it's not as simple as just, medication or therapy. These notes really emphasize the need to confront the stalker's self-deception because they often deny, minimize, or justify their actions.
It must be really tough to break through that, like to challenge their thinking when so much of their reality is based on those warped perceptions.
This is one of the biggest challenges. And a key part of treatment is helping them develop empathy for the victim, understanding the fear and distress they're causing. But again, that's a no easy feat, especially with personality disorders or delusional beliefs in the mix.
So it's about challenging their thoughts, helping them develop coping mechanisms, rebuilding their social skills in a healthier way. What about the legal side of things? Can the justice system actually protect stalking victims?
Well, it can, but according to these notes, it's not always effective. In England and Wales, they use the Protection from Harassment Act 1997 to prosecute stalkers.
Okay, and that often involves restraining orders, right?
Right. But it seems like the application of this law is inconsistent. It varies across different police forces, prosecutors, courts.
So there might be a lack of understanding about how serious stalking is and the impact it has on victims.
It's possible, yeah. And I've even heard that restraining orders can sometimes backfire.
Make things worse.
Yeah. Some stalkers see it as a challenge,
Yeah.
like a sign they're getting to the victim.
Yeah.
And that can actually lead to more stalking or even violence.
That's really concerning. And of course, all of this takes a huge toll on the victim.
Absolutely.
These notes talk about the really profound and lasting effects of stalking.
Yeah, it goes way beyond just being afraid. It's that constant feeling of being unsafe, always looking over your shoulder.
It can really take over your life.
It can. And it can lead to PTSD, depression, anxiety, all sorts of mental health challenges. Victims often have to make drastic changes to their lives, like moving, changing jobs, even withdrawing from social activities just to avoid their stalker.
Their world just shrinks as they try to stay safe.
Exactly.
It's heartbreaking. Okay, what about domestic violence? I know these notes touch on that too, and it feels like that's another issue that often gets swept under the rug.
It is. And the statistics are, they're pretty startling. According to this material, a third of women who survive domestic violence never tell anyone about it.
A third. That's a lot of people suffering in silence.
It is. There are so many complex factors at play. Shame, fear, isolation. These can all prevent victims from seeking help. And even when they do reach out, it's usually to friends, family, neighbors, people they trust. The police are rarely involved.
So they're relying on their personal networks instead of the authorities. Why are so many victims hesitant to involve the police?
Well, the notes suggest several reasons. Some victims feel like the incident was too minor, or a private family matter. Others are afraid of humiliation, or that police involvement would actually make the violence worse. 1 in 8 women even believe that police involvement would make things worse.
Wow. That's a chilling statistic. It shows how much fear and distrust there is.
It does. It highlights the systemic failures and societal attitudes that contribute to this problem.
We've covered some pretty heavy material in this deep dive, haven't we? From the complexities of psychiatric defenses to the realities of stalking and domestic violence.
It's been a lot to unpack, and it's clear that we need to do a lot more to understand the connection between mental health and the criminal justice system.
Wow, we've really gone deep on this one, haven't we?
We have. It seems like every time we peel back one layer of the criminal justice system, there's another, even more complex layer underneath.
Yeah, and what's interesting to me is that these notes, they were probably written for like medical professionals, right?
Right, yeah.
But the insights, they go way beyond just the medical field.
They do, yeah. It's a good reminder that mental health isn't just this isolated personal thing. It's woven into these broader legal and societal issues.
Absolutely. So for our listeners who aren't, lawyers or psychiatrists, why should they care about all of this?
Well, I think it's important to understand how the legal system responds to mental health, because that's a big part of building a society that's both just and compassionate.
Okay, so how does this all connect back to the average person?
Well, think about it. We've seen how mental illness can impact someone's culpability, right?
Right.
Which leads to the need for specific defenses and different approaches within the justice system. We can't just treat everyone the same way.
And then there's the impact of stalking and domestic violence, issues that often have a mental health component to them, either in the perpetrator or the lasting effects on the victim.
Exactly. It makes you wonder, how can the legal system do a better job? How can we address mental health more effectively in criminal justice?
It's a huge question. Like, should the focus shift more towards treatment and rehabilitation? Or should it stay more focused on punishment? And how do you balance the rights of victims with the rights of individuals struggling with mental health?
It's really tricky. There are no easy answers. But I think by engaging with these questions, by challenging our assumptions, we can contribute to a more informed and humane approach.
I think this deep dive has really been eye-opening for me. We've gone through so much, haven't we? Exploring that legal maze, understanding the nuances of psychiatric defenses, confronting the dark realities of stalking and domestic violence.
It's been a lot, yeah, a lot to process. But I think it's so important to talk about these things. It highlights the urgent need for greater awareness, understanding, and real change within the system.
Yeah.
To better support mental well-being and justice for all.
Well said. So to wrap things up, we want to leave you with this. What role can we play in creating that kind of society? One that prioritizes mental health and ensures justice for everyone.
It's a question worth thinking about. And hopefully this deep dive has given you some food for thought, some new insights.
Thank you all for joining us. Until next time, stay curious.